So picture this. You open up your favorite news app, right?
First thing in the morning, usually.
Exactly. And you're just immediately hit with this this barrage of chaotic headlines.
Right.
Like you get a breaking alert about, I don't know, new tariffs on Chinese microchips. And then literally right below that, there's this fierce debate over U.S. border security.
Yeah, or immigration quotas or whatever the crisis of the day is.
Right, exactly. And then you scroll down just a little bit further and you find some like super detailed analysis on a massive domestic infrastructure bill going through Congress. And it feels like you're looking at puzzle pieces from 3 entirely different boxes.
It really does. It feels totally disconnected.
But welcome to the deep dive, because today our mission is to take a stack of incredibly intense, high-level sources. I mean, we're talking think tank surveys, geopolitical analyses, academic journals on Asian governance, and prove that these are actually not separate issues at all.
Not even a little bit.
No. We are exploring the hidden and honestly kind of uncomfortable connective tissue between America's domestic anxieties and its global standoff with China.
Yeah, because, the assumption for a long time has been that a country's foreign policy is just something that happens, well, out there.
Right, across the ocean.
Exactly. We're totally conditioned to compartmentalize it.
Right.
Like, we put domestic politics in one box, foreign trade goes in another, and military alliances are in a third.
Like they don't touch each other.
Right. But the reality is just so much more integrated than that. I mean, what happens inside a country's borders, its demographics, its economic anxieties, its, crumbling roads, that inevitably shapes how it projects power outside of them.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So when leaders talk about foreign policy today, they are actually fundamentally talking about domestic survival.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with how official Washington is framing this, because it represents a massive paradigm shift.
Oh, absolutely.
We've got this really fascinating report from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And the authors analyze how American leaders are actively and explicitly trying to link the home front with the global front.
Right. They anchor a lot of this around President Biden's inaugural speech.
Yeah, he ticked off this massive list of overlapping crises, but he didn't just mention foreign adversaries.
Right. It wasn't just a traditional national security speech.
Not at all. He talked about, a raging virus, growing inequality, systemic racism, a climate in crisis, and America's role in the world. And he presented them as this singular, intertwined challenge.
Which is a huge shift in rhetorical strategy.
It is. And the administration's proposed answer to this whole complex knot is what they call a foreign policy for the middle class.
And that phrase, foreign policy for the middle class, that is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Oh, yeah.
To really get why it's so revolutionary, you have to look back at the post-World War II consensus.
Right, the old playbook.
Exactly. Because for decades, the American foreign policy establishment basically operated on this absolute belief that projecting power abroad, maintaining a massive global military footprint, opening global markets, that all of that would just automatically trickle down to benefit the American public.
Like a rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing.
Precisely. The assumption was what's good for global free trade is inherently good for the worker in Ohio or Pennsylvania.
But this new strategy is basically saying that's not true anymore.
Yeah, it flips the script entirely. It explicitly says that rebuilding domestic strength is the absolute prerequisite for competing with autocracies.
It's like, think about it like a computer operating system.
Okay, I like that.
For the past 50 years, traditional foreign policy has been totally obsessed with upgrading the user interface, right?
Oh, sure. Signing massive, flashy global trade deals.
Yes. Expanding international organizations, policing global shipping lanes. Meanwhile, they were completely ignoring a massive memory leak in the core kernel of the system.
The domestic middle class.
Exactly. The industrial base was hollowing out, wages were stagnating, public infrastructure was just crumbling.
Right.
So this new approach is essentially the system administrators finally admitting, hey, we cannot run these complex global programs if the motherboard itself is melting down.
That is a great way to put it. And, the public is painfully aware of that memory leak.
Oh, the data on this is wild.
It really is. The survey data in the Chicago Council report, it reveals this staggering disconnect between the government's historical foreign policy aims and the actual lived reality of the citizens.
Right, because they asked people who actually benefits from all this.
Exactly. When Americans were asked who benefits a great deal from U.S. foreign policy, 59% pointed to large businesses.
Almost 60%.
Yeah. And another 50% said the wealthy.
Right. But then, and this is the part that just stopped me in my tracks, when they asked what percentage believed the American middle class benefits, the number plummeted to 11%.
11%.
I mean, that is just a devastating indictment of the last half century of globalization.
It really is.
If nearly 90% of your population believes that your grand strategy actively excludes them, you don't just have an economic problem, you have a massive political vulnerability.
Which is exactly why a phrase like foreign policy for the middle class isn't just some catchy slogan. I mean, it's an emergency patch to stop the political bleeding.
Yeah, they have to convince people the system works for them.
Right. And the survey goes even deeper into this inward turn. They ask the public what factors are most important for maintaining U.S. international influence.
And the answers are not what you'd expect from a traditional foreign policy survey.
Not at all. 73% of Americans say improving public education is very important.
Education for foreign policy.
Exactly. 70% say strengthening democracy at home. 66% say maintaining economic power.
So basically, fix our own problems first.
Notice what isn't at the top of that list.
Let me guess. Promoting human rights abroad.
Yep. That ranked far lower. Funding international organizations, maintaining military dominance in remote regions, all lower. The American public overwhelmingly wants their own house in order before they worry about policing the neighborhood.
Although, interestingly, the report notes that even though the administration pushes infrastructure as a key foreign policy tool, the public ranked increasing public spending on infrastructure 10th out of 12 items.
Right, that was a surprising little detail.
Yeah. It's like the public doesn't inherently see a new bridge as a weapon against foreign adversaries.
No, they don't make that direct mental link.
But they do feel this really profound sense of vulnerability. And that vulnerability is entirely focused on one specific neighbor. China. The anxiety leaping off the pages of this data is just palpable.
Well, the numbers are shifting incredibly fast.
Yeah, 40% of Americans now say China is economically stronger than the U.S., which is a massive jump from 31% just 2 years prior in 2019. But here's the statistic that really made me pause. For the first time in Chicago Council polling history, less than half of Americans, only 46%, believe the U.S. is militarily stronger than China.
And that right there, that perceived loss of primacy, that is the engine driving current U.S. policy.
Really? Yeah. Just the perception of it?
Absolutely. Because when a populace believes it's losing its dominant position, the political landscape shifts dramatically. It explains why we're seeing such widespread, bipartisan public support for things that would have been, totally unthinkable 20 years ago.
Like what?
Like sweeping trade restrictions, massive tariffs, aggressive industrial policies designed to bolster U.S. businesses at the expense of foreign competitors.
Oh, right. Banning certain tech, that sort of thing.
Exactly. The public no longer views trade with China as mutually beneficial. A majority now actually says trade between the two nations does more to weaken U.S. national security.
Wow. So the whole integration experiment is just over in the eyes of the public.
Totally over.
But, setting alliances and tariffs abroad is only half the battle here. If we connect this to the bigger picture and look at how China's playing this exact same game, we see a really fascinating mirror image.
Oh, the Giuseppe Germanaro dossier.
Yes.
Yeah.
China and the United States, two national security plans compared.
It's a brilliant piece of analysis.
It really is. Because the U.S. is explicitly linking its domestic health to its foreign rivalry, right?
Right.
And Germanaro argues that despite having vastly different political systems, both Washington and Beijing are utilizing these deeply holistic approaches.
Yeah, they are both tightly linking internal stability, economic strategy, and foreign policy. But importantly, they are responding to different systemic pressures.
So break that down for us. What does the U.S. approach look like in practice, according to Germanaro?
Well, Germanaro looks at the United States and sees a country engaged in a strategy of calculated retreat and reindustrialization.
Calculated retreat? That sounds almost like a military term.
It basically is. The U.S. establishment has realized that it is dangerously overextended globally. I mean, it cannot fight terrorism in the Middle East, contain Russia in Europe, and manage a rising China in the Indo-Pacific all at the same time.
Especially not while its domestic middle class is collapsing, like we just talked about.
Exactly. So the U.S. is trying to pull back, but it's attempting to do so in a highly organized way. Germanaro argues the U.S. is structuring its alliances into 4 strict hierarchical bands.
Okay, let's break down those bans, because when I read this, it revealed a ruthlessly pragmatic worldview.
It is very ruthless.
So ban 1 is the inner circle. We're talking AUKUS Australia, the United Kingdom, the US,
Right.
and what the author calls the Pax Silica tech allies, which is such a cool term.
Yeah, peace through silicon.
Right. So this includes nations critical to the semiconductor supply chain, places like Japan, Taiwan, the Netherlands.
The heavy hitters in tech.
Yeah, they are tightly integrating artificial intelligence and advanced military technology. These are the countries granted, like, co-participation in major strategic projects.
The U.S. is essentially deputizing these Band 1 allies to manage the most critical front lines of the tech and military competition with China.
Right. But it's Band 2 where German Arrow's analysis gets deeply controversial.
Oh yeah, this part is a tough pill to swallow.
So Band 2. The author suggests this ban consists of frontline states, and he specifically points to the European Union, that are destined to be squeezed and essentially sacrificed in regional conflicts.
Yeah.
I mean, if you are running a manufacturing business in Germany right now, or you're a policymaker in Brussels, this U.S. strategy essentially views you as a buffer.
A shock absorber.
A shock absorber. The author is suggesting the U.S. is actively preparing to let Europe absorb the economic and military blows of regional conflicts.
Yeah.
How does that fit with the constant rhetoric we hear about the, sacred bond of the transatlantic alliance?
I know, it's a really harsh assessment, but viewed strictly through the lens of geopolitical realism, the mechanics of it actually make sense.
Oh, so?
Well, the United States desperately needs time. It needs a decade or more to rebuild its industrial base, reshore critical supply chains, and pivot its military focus almost entirely to the Indo-Pacific to counter China.
Right. They can't be everywhere at once anymore.
Exactly. So to buy that time, it has to offload the massive burden of global security. By forcing Europe to take on the primary exhausting burden of managing conflicts in its own backyard, most notably containing Russia, the U.S. frees up its own resources.
Wow, so they just leave Europe to deal with the messy stuff.
Yeah. The author is arguing that this creates a massive, unstable transition period in global politics, and Washington is perfectly willing to let Europe pay the economic price of that transition.
That is a staggering way to view allies.
It is cold, hard, realpolitik.
Okay, so we have Band 1 as the tech inner circle, and Band 2 as the European shock absorbers. What's Band 3?
Band 3 he describes as hunting grounds.
Hunting grounds. Yikes.
Yeah, this refers to places like Africa and the Arctic. These are regions where the U.S. and China can engage in fierce economic and resource competition without triggering a direct global war.
Just extracting resources, basically.
Right. And finally, Band 4 includes multipolar players like India and Brazil.
Okay.
Nations that are large enough to resist being pulled into either orbit completely. They're just trying to play both sides to maximize their own advantage during this transitional phase.
Okay, so that's the U.S. playbook. Pragmatic retreat, rigid concentric circles, and offloading regional security.
Yep.
Contrast that with the Chinese strategy. Because according to the document, Beijing's approach is rooted in a Confucian cultural tradition of belonging to the whole.
Right, which sounds very harmonious.
Yeah, at least on paper, and in their diplomatic rhetoric, they present this highly egalitarian, multilateral vision.
Unlike the U.S. with its rigid politico-military alliances like NATO or AUKUS.
Right. China champions economic organizations like the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They aggressively position themselves as the defender of globalization and peaceful, regulated international relations.
And the mechanics of how they build that influence are completely different from the traditional U.S. model.
Right, because Germanaro points out that while the U.S. historically relied really heavily on non-governmental organization aid or lectures on democratic norms.
Or complex financial interventions through the IMF.
Exactly. But China uses productive infrastructure investments. We see this with the Belt and Road Initiative everywhere.
No, it's massive.
They are building deep water ports, sprawling road networks, high-speed railways in Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia.
And you can see why that works. If you are the leader of a developing nation, a brand new airport and a modernized power grid look much more appealing than a stern lecture on human rights paired with a small conditional aid grant.
Right. Here's a bridge versus here's a pamphlet on democracy.
But
it's an easy choice for a lot of these leaders.
Exactly. That is the allure of the Chinese model. However, Germanaro is really quick to dismantle the facade there and point out the deep hypocrisies in China's stance.
Because it's not all just harmonious win-win building projects.
Not at all. The fog of these peaceful multilateral statements hides the cold realism of a ruling class that is entirely focused on regime security and expansion.
Right.
I mean, China acts as the champion of free trade on the global stage, urging open markets for its exports. But they use fierce, impenetrable protectionism at home when it suits them.
Rules for thee, but not for me.
Precisely. Furthermore, those infrastructure investments, they are not charity. They are often highly strategic, designed to secure resource supply chains for Beijing.
And they're facing massive internal challenges as a result of this rapid expansion.
Oh, huge challenges. They're dealing with a staggering amount of bad loans abroad. And they impose these draconian, secretive guarantees on the developing countries they lend to.
Yeah, I've read about that. When a country defaults, China often just takes control of the physical infrastructure.
Yes, like the famous case of the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka.
Right. So both of these massive superpowers, the U.S. with its bands of alliances and China with its infrastructure web, they're desperately trying to stabilize their internal foundations while ruthlessly outmaneuvering each other globally.
But, strategies are executed by people.
Right.
And people are driven by complex, often totally irrational emotions. To really understand why these grand strategies are taking on such a fever pitch, we have to move from policy to psychology.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because that brings us to an incredibly illuminating piece called America Divided: The Borders of Identity and Global Power.
This was a fascinating read.
It's a revelation.
Yeah.
The core thesis here argues that the two most explosive, polarizing issues in America today, immigration and border security on one hand, and the strategic rivalry with China on the other, are not separate issues at all.
They feel so different when you watch the news, though.
Right, but the author argues they are fundamentally the exact same psychological question manifesting in two different directions. Both of these massive debates are just different ways of the American populace asking, what does America become in the 21st century, and who controls its future?
So the internal fear of changing demographics and the external fear of a rising superpower are just feeding off each other.
Exactly. Let's look at the border at home first. Because the United States has always lived with this profound, unresolved contradiction. It constantly celebrates immigration as the engine of the American dream, the whole melting pot narrative.
Right, give me your tired, your poor.
Yeah. Yet simultaneously, it has always harbored a deep terror that new arrivals will destroy the nation's cultural fabric and economic stability. This tension is quite literally as old as the country itself.
And the source material walks through this history in a way that really forces you to reevaluate modern political discourse.
It really does. We romanticize Ellis Island today. We look at those sepia-tone photos of arrivals and think of it as this beautiful thing.
But the reality for Irish, Italian, and Eastern European immigrants at the time was brutal.
Rampant xenophobia, extreme labor exploitation, confinement to ethnic ghettos.
Right. But the pivotal turning point the text highlights, which, frankly, frequently gets glossed over in standard history classes, is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
Right. That's a huge piece of the puzzle here.
It was the very first major U.S. law banning immigration based explicitly on race and nationality. American anxiety about domestic immigration and American anxiety specifically about China have been inextricably linked for over 140 years.
Wow. I never really put those two together like that.
Yeah, the Chinese Exclusion Act established a really powerful template in the American political psyche. Economic fear combined with cultural anxiety inevitably results in restrictive, often draconian policy.
And we're seeing that exact template play out today.
Absolutely. The imagery and rhetoric surrounding the southern U.S. border activate those exact same deep psychological mechanisms. And the text brings in sociological frameworks to explain this, specifically group threat theory.
I want to spend some time on group threat theory because it explains so much of what we see on our screens every day. How does the text actually define the mechanics of this theory?
Well, group threat theory posits that when dominant populations perceive rapid demographic, cultural, or economic change, their reaction is not necessarily born out of pure malice or inherent bigotry.
Okay, so what is it born out of?
Instead, it stems from a deep-seated existential fear of loss.
Fear of loss.
Yeah. It is the fear of losing familiarity, losing social status, and losing what they perceive as their cultural sovereignty. When people feel their group's dominance is slipping, they become highly protective of borders, both literal and symbolic.
So the border becomes more than just a border.
Exactly. The southern border in this context isn't just a physical line of demarcation. It transforms into a highly charged symbolic frontier representing order versus chaos, traditional nationalism versus unmoored globalization.
That explains why the imagery is so incredibly potent. When you see news footage of migrant caravans or overcrowded detention centers or massive wall construction, it bypasses the logical centers of the brain entirely.
Right.
It just triggers emotional fight or flight reactions that, a spreadsheet about labor shortages or economic growth just cannot touch.
Absolutely. So the internal border represents a fear of losing control from within. But then we pan out to the rivalry abroad with China, which represents the fear of losing control from the outside.
Because for decades, the foundational U.S. strategy regarding China was integration, right?
Right. The thought process in Washington was essentially, if we trade with them, if we bring them into the World Trade Organization, if we expose them to global markets, they will inevitably become a Western-style democracy.
It was a breathtakingly arrogant assumption, looking back on it.
Oh, completely.
It was born entirely out of American exceptionalism. The idea was that our system is so obviously superior that mere exposure to it would cause the Chinese Communist Party to just voluntarily dissolve itself.
Which,
spoiler alert, didn't happen.
It did not happen. China used the integration to become unfathomably wealthy and technologically advanced, all while actually tightening its centralized political control.
Right.
And now, the realization of that failed gamble is triggering deep American fears of decline, historical humiliation, and a permanent loss of global prestige.
Which brings up an incredible, almost tragic contradiction that the text highlights. Consider the economic realities we have built for ourselves.
Right.
Politicians campaign furiously, often using apocalyptic language, against immigration. Yet, entire foundational pillars of the American economy, agriculture, construction, hospitality, quietly but utterly rely on undocumented labor to survive.
It's true. Without it, prices would skyrocket and industries would just collapse.
Exactly. And then on the flip side of that exact same coin, we spent decades eagerly outsourcing our manufacturing base to China to secure cheap consumer goods and inflate corporate profits.
We gleefully handed over our industrial capacity. We did. And now we panic because China used that exact wealth and industrial capacity to become an industrial superpower capable of challenging us. We literally methodically built the exact scenarios that we are now terrified of.
It is the ultimate biting paradox of modern globalization. We chased efficiency and profit, and in doing so, created massive vulnerabilities everywhere.
Yeah. And this dynamic brings us to a crucial historical framework the text introduces: the Thucydides trap.
Right. We hear this term thrown around in foreign policy circles constantly. But let's actually dissect the mechanics of it. What is the Thucydides trap, and why is it tightening around the US and China right now?
So the concept originates from the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, who observed the Peloponnesian War.
Going way back.
Way back. He wrote that it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. The theory suggests that whenever a rising power threatens to displace an established anxious hegemon, the resulting structural stress almost always leads to conflict.
Because neither side wants to back down.
Right. The established power fears losing its privileges and sets up barriers. The rising power feels disrespected and constrained and pushes back.
We saw this dynamic between the British Empire and a rising Germany before World War I, and obviously between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But the text argues this modern iteration is uniquely dangerous because of the technological component. The race for advanced semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and global digital platforms isn't just about economic market share. It is viewed as a civilizational competition.
Because technologies today are intimate. They aren't just weapon systems, they are information ecosystems.
Think about TikTok.
Exactly. The anxiety over platforms like TikTok isn't merely about data privacy. It is a profound fear that a foreign adversary has direct access to the psychological shaping and cultural consumption of the next generation of Americans.
That's a terrifying thought.
It is. The Thucydides trap today isn't just about who has more battleships, it's about who controls the algorithms that define reality.
So we have an anxious nation, internally divided over who belongs, and externally terrified of losing its top spot in the global hierarchy.
We've established the policy mechanisms and the psychological fears.
Which leads us to our final and undeniably most provocative source. It attempts to put a very specific, highly controversial name to this fear.
It's an academic paper from the Journal of Asian Governance titled Racism, Racial Hierarchy Ideology, and U.S. Strategic Competition with China.
Now, before we delve into this, it is crucial to establish our parameters for this discussion.
Definitely.
The concepts in this paper touch on the most highly charged, sensitive issues in modern political discourse. Our goal here is not to endorse these arguments, nor is it to debunk them or take a side.
Right. We're remaining strictly neutral.
Exactly. Our role is strictly to unpack the analytical framework constructed by the authors of this study, Kai-Yu Xu and Zhao Yuhe. We are examining how these academics attempt to explain the intensity of the current geopolitical landscape.
Right. The authors are attempting to answer a really specific question. Why does the U.S. react with such unique, visceral aggression to China's rise, and how does that connect to its internal political turmoil?
And to answer this, they introduced two core theoretical concepts. The first is DRHI, domestic racism and racial hierarchy ideology.
And the second is IRHI, international racism and racial hierarchy ideology.
Let's examine the domestic framework first, because the authors argue that the United States has operated on a long-standing ethnic stratification system. Historically, they say, this system has been dominated by white Americans across political, economic, and cultural spheres. And the core of their argument is that as the U.S. demographic reality shifts, specifically a rapidly growing population of ethnic minorities and a proportionally shrinking white population, this traditional hierarchy is facing an unprecedented existential threat.
Right, and the authors argue that this demographic shift is the true hidden root cause of recent extreme political polarization.
They really dig into voting data to make this case, don't they?
They do. They analyze voting data and political platforms, and they observe that ethnic minorities overwhelmingly tend to support the Democratic Party, while the Republican base relies heavily and increasingly on white voters.
Okay.
According to the paper, the response to these changing demographics has been a concerted effort to manipulate the electoral system.
And the authors specifically point to the proliferation of new voter ID laws, aggressive redistricting efforts, and the purging of voter rolls in various states.
Yes. The framework of the paper explicitly labels these tactics as voter repression.
Right.
They argue these tactics are purposefully designed to dilute minority political influence and artificially maintain the traditional white-centered hierarchy in the face of a changing populace.
Conversely, the authors note that the Democratic Party has pushed for expansive voting rights bills to counteract these measures, though they've obviously faced severe legislative roadblocks.
Right. That's the domestic political battlefield they describe.
But here is the critical pivot the authors make, connecting this domestic turmoil directly to the geopolitical arena.
This is the key link.
They argue that in the face of these intense, seemingly intractable domestic, racial, and political conflicts, taking a tough-on-China stance has become a highly beneficial, unifying political tool for politicians in both parties.
The authors basically suggest that foreign policy is being weaponized for domestic political management.
How does that work for each side?
Well, for Republicans, the paper claims that blaming China for the economic struggles of the white working class, pointing to stolen manufacturing jobs and unfair trade practices, helps mobilize their base and redirect anger outward.
And for Democrats?
For Democrats, adopting a hardline hawkish stance against China provides a rare, desperately needed area of bipartisan agreement. It can demonstrate strength and help them advance broader domestic agendas without appearing weak on national security.
Essentially, the authors are arguing that the strategic competition with China is being actively used as a pressure valve.
Exactly.
It distracts from and helps manage the terrifying domestic anxieties surrounding race and demographic replacement.
That is their domestic theory. Then, the paper expands this concept globally with their second concept, IRRHI, or International Racism and Racial Hierarchy Ideology.
In this section, the authors argue that U.S. foreign policy has historically been steeped in Anglo-Saxonism, this deeply ingrained belief that Western, specifically white, civilization is inherently superior and should rightfully lead the global order.
And they argue that the architecture of global institutions post-WWII was designed by and for Western powers to maintain this dominance.
The authors make a very blunt assertion here. They argue that the U.S. establishment simply cannot psychologically, culturally, or ideologically accept the prospect of losing its dominant global position to a non-Western, non-white nation like China.
Right. The framework suggests it's one thing to share power with a European ally. It is entirely another, within this worldview, to cede primacy to an Asian power.
The paper claims this racial ideology is the primary reason why the U.S. categorically rejected the idea of a new type of great power relationship that was proposed by China during the Obama administration.
which was a proposal that basically asked for mutual respect of core interests.
Right. Instead, the authors argue the U.S. reverted almost immediately to a Cold War mentality of aggressive containment.
And to support this, they point to the architecture of new military alliances. Specifically, they return to German Arrow's Band 1.
Ah, right, AUKUS.
Exactly. The authors highlight AUKUS, the security pact between the U.S., the U.K., and Australia, as evidence of the U.S. instinctively prioritizing Anglo-Saxon, English-speaking alliances over broader, more diverse international cooperation when the stakes are highest.
The authors also point to the domestic rhetoric during the COVID-19 pandemic as a clear, real-world manifestation of these racial ideologies bleeding directly into foreign policy.
Ooh, the language used was intense.
Yeah, they argue the specific stigmatization of China, the use of phrases like the Kung flu or the China virus by political leaders, wasn't just careless language. Within their framework, it was a deliberate activation of historical racial tropes to rally domestic support by casting the geopolitical rival as fundamentally unclean and alien.
So what does this all mean?
Well, I want to pause here, actually, because if I am listening to this deep dive right now, I might be pushing back hard.
Okay, play devil's advocate. What's the pushback?
I might think, hold on a second. We are talking about China, a nation with a massive and rapidly expanding military that is aggressively building artificial islands in the South China Sea.
True.
They have a documented, systemic history of massive intellectual property theft that costs the global economy billions.
So true.
And their political system, a highly surveilled, centralized autocracy, is completely antithetical to Western liberal democracy.
Right.
So isn't this just normal, entirely expected geopolitical competition between two massive, ideologically opposed superpowers? Is it really analytically fair or even accurate for these authors to reduce all this incredibly complex statecraft, economics, and military strategy down to racism?
That is a vital pushback, and honestly, it highlights the difficulty of applying single-lens theories to global geopolitics. Because great power competition is a brutal historical reality that exists totally independently of race. Thucydides, as we discussed earlier, wasn't analyzing race when Athens and Sparta went to war. He was analyzing the raw mechanics of power.
Exactly.
A realist perspective would argue that the U.S. would be aggressively containing any nation, regardless of its racial makeup. That threatened its hegemony to the degree China does.
Right. If a unified Europe or a resurgent Russia had the exact same economic and technological trajectory as China currently does, the U.S. would likely be deploying the exact same tariffs and forming similar military alliances to contain them.
The survival instinct of a superpower is colorblind.
Yes.
However, the reason the author's framework demands examination is because it asks us to look closely at the rhetoric and the specific intensity of the modern rivalry.
How so?
Even if the underlying structural conflict is driven by pure power dynamics, the authors argue that the way the conflict is fought and the language used to mobilize the public is deeply racialized.
I see.
When geopolitical competition is continually framed in political discourse as a clash of civilizations, it taps into deeper, darker historical currents.
It's not just a trade war anymore.
Exactly. When domestic policies are proposed at the state level that target specific ethnicities, like the authors mentioning recent legislative attempts in some states to ban property purchases based on Chinese national origin, it reveals an emotional and cultural panic that goes far beyond standard economic tariffs or military posturing in the Pacific.
It gets personal.
The authors are arguing that you cannot analytically separate the emotional intensity of the China rivalry from the emotional intensity of America's internal racial and demographic shifts. They feed off each other, creating a massive feedback loop of anxiety.
Man, we have covered a massive amount of conceptual ground today, tracing the invisible lines that connect your local pothole to the global balance of power.
It's a lot to process.
It is. We started by looking at the Biden administration's attempt to fuse domestic rebuilding with global strategy, recognizing that a foreign policy for the middle class is born out of the realization that a hollowed-out nation cannot project power.
Right.
We saw how the U.S. strategy of pragmatic retreat and rigid hierarchical alliances mirrors China's strategy of rapid expansion and multilateral infrastructure dominance, even as both behemoths face deep internal vulnerabilities and hypocrisies.
We dug into the profound psychological mechanisms, too.
Yeah, group threat theory and the Thucydides trap to really understand the fears of cultural replacement at the border and the terror of decline on the global stage.
And we ended by unpacking that challenging academic theory that argues racial hierarchy and demographic panic are the hidden engines adding a dangerous, volatile intensity to this entire global conflict.
So setting all the grand theories and academic frameworks aside for a second, what does this actually mean for you?
Right. Why does the listener care?
Why does this matter the next time you look at your phone? Well, the next time you open that news app and you hear a politician giving an impassioned speech about securing semiconductor supply chains in Taiwan or arguing vehemently about border enforcement in Texas, you now have the context to hear what they are actually saying.
It's never just about the surface issue.
Never. They aren't just talking about the mechanics of international trade or the legalities of immigration law. They are participating in a massive, high-stakes, real-time debate about American identity.
The overarching lesson from all these sources, the think tank data, the geopolitical analysis, the sociological and historical frameworks, is that a nation's foreign policy is ultimately a reflection of its internal soul.
That's a powerful way to put it.
I want to leave you with a final thought drawn directly from the undercurrents of the America Divided text. It's a concept that forces you to step back from the daily news cycle and look at the grand, often unforgiving sweep of history.
What's the thought?
Every empire, every global superpower since the dawn of civilization eventually has to face two terrifying existential questions. The first question is, who are we?
The identity struggle.
Exactly. This is the struggle over internal identity, culture, and belonging. The second question is, what happens if we are no longer dominant?
The fear of decline.
Right. This is the struggle over external relevance, security, and pride. And right now, the United States is wrestling with both of those monumental questions at the exact same time.
At the exact same time.
The fierce, often bitter debate over immigration and demographics challenges America's identity from within. Simultaneously, the staggering rapid rise of China challenges its supreme position from the outside.
It's pressure from all sides.
It is. The ultimate test for the 21st century isn't going to be decided simply by who builds the fastest microchip, who commands the largest navy, or who secures the most critical minerals.
So what is the test?
The real defining test is whether a superpower can successfully manage its own internal demographic transformation and navigate its own relative geopolitical decline without surrendering its wisdom, its values, and its stability to fear.
Wow. And when you look at the world through that specific lens, suddenly that chaotic, overwhelming jumble of headlines on your phone isn't a jumble at all.
It makes perfect sense.
It does. It's not a collection of random events. It's the real-time story of a nation desperately trying to figure out exactly who it is and where it belongs in a rapidly, irreversibly changing world.